Good evening and welcome to Making the Case. I'm Yodit Tewolde. 3 Pennsylvania police officers are facing manslaughter charges tonight in connection with the shooting death of an 8-year-old girl outside of a high school football game. The officers Devon Smith, Dolan and Brian Devaney were watching the crowd at the end of the game in the Philadelphia suburb of Sharon Hill when 2 teenage boys began shooting at each other. The officers then opened fire as well, killing Fanta Bility and injuring 4 others. Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolensmer said the officers recklessly fired 25 shots at a moving car. A grand jury investigation found 4 out of the 5 victims, including 8-year-old Fanta, were struck by bullets that came from the officers' guns. Joining me now is Philadelphia attorney Lennon Edwards. He's a criminal defense attorney, and also with us, retired NYPD detective Marq Claxton. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you.
All right, Lennon, let me start with you. These charges against these 3 cops 5 months after the shooting, it is not the norm as far as officer-related shootings go, but the charges were filed quicker than most. Your reaction to the grand jury returning indictments in this case?
I don't get excited about charges. I get excited about convictions. This is a situation where they knew within days after this took place that those rounds came from the weapons that the officers had. Why they waited months, God only knows. But this is definitely something that is so outrageous that action should have been taken sooner. The grand jury did the right thing with the evidence put in front of them. They made the right decision that these officers should be charged. Absolutely, that's the right thing. But we're looking forward to the next step. I think that's what needs to happen.
Mark, your reaction to the charges?
I absolutely agree with Attorney Edwards. I think what's most significant is not necessarily the initial charges that come out, but the commitment by the prosecutor's office to fully prosecute police officers. You know, we've seen other cases where charges may have been levied that appear to be sufficient or address the issue, but then they follow those charges with a weak prosecutorial effort. The rubber meets the road when the prosecutors really impose themselves into charging these police officers and conducting a trial and really forcefully push the point and establish and prove those charges.
I think you two bring up an interesting point because we're so used to, I'm sorry, Lennon, I just wanted to say we're so used to the bare minimum that when we do get charges filed in officer-related shootings, we find that as a victory, but we need to see it all the way through to a conviction. Lennon, your thought, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, when you think about what happened here, it's unbelievable. Officers, you have, if you look geographically at the location where this took place, you have a high school. Right next door to that, you have an elementary school. Next to that, you have the athletic field. And these officers, I mean, there's more than one report here, but these officers entered an area where it's designed to hold a large volume of people. You have 2 teenagers shooting at each other. You have, and that's obviously reckless, and it shouldn't happen. But you have officers who show up, and the officers pull out their weapons and begin shooting into a crowd. It is unbelievable. You have so many incidents where, you have children present. You have young children. Here we have an 8-year-old and her 12-year-old sibling. They both hit. Officers are trained. These 2 young teenagers who are shooting at each other, they're not trained. They're not police officers. They have no sworn duty to protect the public. But these officers have this responsibility. And when they show up and they pull out their weapons and start shooting into a crowd, of course they should be charged. This is unbelievable. It should never happen. And when they pull out those weapons and start shooting, you have to think about this. If you look at the athletic field, there are 4 houses, it looks like, on the opposite side of that athletic field. A bullet travels, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but in 1 second, a 9mm round can travel almost a quarter mile. Okay, in less than a second, that bullet could have gone anywhere in that area and killed more people. These officers fired 25 shots. 25 shots. It's unbelievable.
Well, Mark,
it's a miracle that they didn't kill more people.
Mark, let me bring you in on that point. What violations occurred? What police protocol, use of force policies were violated through the actions of these officers? And that, to Lennon's point, they did shoot in the direction of gunfire, but didn't actually have a target.
Yeah, a key part of police training places the responsibility and the additional burden on police officers to be responsible for each and every round fired. And then basic firearms training that civilians receive teaches everyone that you should know what's in front of you and what's beyond the target that you're aiming at. And then the law oftentimes will lay out what prohibits police officers, or at least department policy will indicate whether police officers can fire at moving vehicles or even from moving vehicles. For example, the Pennsylvania State Police, they have a very strict policy regarding firing at or from moving vehicles for their police officers. Only in very strict circumstances is that allowed. So that comes into question as well. And common sense should overwhelm a professional police officer. You always have to be on point. You can't afford to recklessly discharge a firearm at any point for any reason. And you always have to consider what is in front of you, beyond you, to the side of you, and weigh your options and use better tactics. I think an important part of what will occur right now in the immediate is that there should be an immediate review of all training and tactical decisions, and a review of the law and the policies and procedures for that particular department, and anything that the department can do to support the prosecutor's office in charging these police officers, I think would be the appropriate action.
Well, a follow-up, Mark. In that situation, I know cops have to make, split-second decisions, but in that moment when investigators already found that the gunshots were aimed in their direction, at that time, what were officers supposed to do?
First of all, I got to make the point that I always make when you're talking about police engaging in discharging their weapons or facing a discharge of weapons. Police officers are volunteers, we're not victims. And you have to rely heavily on the training and tactical training that you have. And there are circumstances that will pop up immediately, automatically, that cause you to have a certain reaction. That's when you rely on your tactics and training. If you have an opportunity to seek cover, you do that. You have to consider what's around you and the threat that exists to other individual civilians around you as well before you decide to discharge the weapon. Are there opportunities for bad decisions that lead to fatalities? There are opportunities, but you minimize those by using the best possible tactics, relying on your training, and always abiding by the law. And that's what's drilled into police officers day in and day out in the police academy. That's why it's significant and substantive to have a quality, updated training and tactics program in every police agency, so you can minimize the risk of fatalities, civilian fatalities.
Mark and Lennon, please stand by, because there's so much more to unpack in this case with my panel of experts after this short break. You're watching Making the Case. Welcome back to Making the Case. 3 police officers have been charged with manslaughter and reckless endangerment after shooting and killing an 8-year-old girl following a high school football game. Still with me are my panel of experts. All right, guys. Lennon, this question's for you. So there was some outrage when news of murder charges were filed against the 2 young men responsible for setting things in motion that night. The DA eventually dropped those charges against them because he said that the evidence just wasn't there. But the DA always knew that the bullet that killed, for example, 8-year-old Fanta, that came from the officer's gun. So why charge the two men, or why not charge them all?
I have a few ideas why. First of all, it's easy to blame the two young black men. That's something that our society seems to default to. They're there, and they were doing something they shouldn't have been doing. So let's protect the police. Let's cover up for the officers. That's a pattern that we continue to see. But for public outcry, that would have been the case here. It would have been swept under the rug. But these officers, you can't enforce the law by committing a crime. These officers pulled out guns and they shot and they kept shooting. And we entrust our police officers with the power of life and death. So they cannot be treated with a leniency that your average doesn't even enjoy. They have to be held responsible. They have to be accountable. No one's saying that they have to be perfect, but they have to think before they act. They have to think before they pull the trigger. And, it is clear to me that they know these three officers shot. It hasn't been determined yet which officer, as far as I know, which officer's gun the fatal bullets came from. But if they can't figure that out, just like they do with a car full of young black men, when they can't figure out whose gun it is, everybody goes, right? They should do the same thing here. Every officer
absolutely.
That's involved ought to go.
Mark, well, first, before my question, moving on to whether these officers should be fired, do you agree with Lennon that they should all be charged, even if they can't determine which officer shot that fatal shot?
In essence, yes, I do agree. In essence, what the officers engaged in a course of conduct individually and collectively that created such a substantial risk of death and didn't cause the death of the 8-year-old. So I believe they should all be charged. And let's hope for the best possible forensic examinations. Let's hope that they're able to determine which police officer fired the fatal round. But their course of conduct is well established with these charges, the reckless endangerment charge and the manslaughter charge. No need to worry about the level of intent, which normally people are worried about in these type of cases when you charge police officers. In this case, it was just a matter of their conduct being so reckless and then them engaging in a course of conduct that created such a substantial risk of death that they have to be held responsible. So no one should escape accountability, and I think that's what people are really expecting. Even people who are not really strong on what's overall police reform seem to be more open to the idea of fuller accountability for police in this country, and I think that's playing out in some of the more recent charges that have been leveled against police officers.
Well, Mark, usually we see these officers involved in a shooting, outrage prompts an investigation internally, and we rarely ever see that punishment internally within the department. I'm not sure if these officers are going to be fired, but should they? Now that criminal charges have been filed, should they go from being suspended with pay to actually being let go?
I'm a proponent of full due process, and I think that police officers should be afforded that same level of due process, if you will. What really restricts what municipalities and agencies can do with police officers in large part comes from agreements and arrangements that they have with too often the unions that may represent these police officers, or sometimes the fraternal organizations such as the National FOP that sometimes serves as the collective bargaining agent for police officers in smaller departments. So I think the city, the municipality will be guided by what they are able to do, and I hope that they apply full due process. We want to make sure that there is nothing that will allow officers to claim that they're being, targeted or victimized or given special prosecution. which will impact the outcome of the case. So let's afford them full due process. What's common is that police officers are suspended for a certain period of time without pay. There may be a time further on down the road after 30 days or 60 days where there is an opportunity to suspend them without pay. But whatever the due process is, I believe they should be afforded that.
Lennon, the attorneys representing these three officers in a statement wrote, quote, "These three good men are innocent and remain heartbroken for all who have suffered because of this senseless violence." Listen, you know, some of these officers don't have the intent to hurt some people, right? And they may be good people, good citizens. However, their actions still should be held accountable, and their actions sometimes amount to a crime. And so this idea that good people can't be held accountable, especially cops, what do you say to that? What is your response?
Preposterous. You have a situation here where, look, the population, and I hate to say this, but I feel it strongly, that this is, every time a Black person gets killed by a police officer, and here we have a child, they talk about training, and nothing ever happens. I think the real thing here is, what is the value of a Black life? Would they have shot into a crowd of white kids, of white teenagers in a different area of town? I doubt that would have been the case. I don't believe that there's any police department in the United States that trains their officers to shoot into a crowd of children, of people. That's not on the books. So why these officers did that under this circumstance, why they didn't, when they arrived, first assess the threat, figure out where is it coming from, what is it, and tell you the truth, if they're being fired upon, they are supposed to take cover. That's what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to pull out their guns and start shooting. Take cover and make an assessment of what's going on. If they can apprehend the perps, then great. If they cannot, their job is to protect the innocent, not pursue perps at the expense of the innocent. That's what happened here. And if they can't get these guys, let them go. Call it in. Report the last direction that you saw them go and a description of them, and tend to the wounded. That's what they're supposed to do. But these guys, they pulled out their guns and they started shooting. How is that in any way acceptable policing? It's just not. So the idea that they're good and they feel bad, they should feel bad. And what they did was absolutely not good in any way, shape, or form. And I wouldn't characterize them as good men.
Marq, I want to ask you, I have less than a minute left, but I wanted to ask, with the grand jury returning these indictments, what message does this send to not only communities of color, but to the law enforcement community?
I think the communities of color, understandably, are given a side eye to the justice system. For too long, the history is quite predictable, and it works in the favor of police officers, especially when you have a Black victim in this case. So as far as police, as the communities of color are concerned, there's no significant trust in this process, which is why it's important for the prosecutor's office not to play footsie and give us window dressing charges. For police officers, any charges, anytime you have an indictment or charges, even given its history, that it is a significant ripple throughout law enforcement. Not enough of a ripple for them to change habits or to address the toxicity within police culture. There is much more that needs to be done, as the attorney touched on, that will address the issues of toxicity within policing and the danger, the clear and present danger that exists in communities of color at the hands of police.